They assumed a volcano was dangerous and that they wouldn't be allowed to go on one if it was going to cause them harm. They were wrong. Safety systems in New Zealand adventure tourism are not guaranteed. It's a calculated gamble, and it's the tourist who carries the risk. On December 9, 2019, 47 people stepped on the crater floor of Whakaari White Island, New Zealand's most active volcano. They weren't trespassers, they were paying customers, tourists. They had signed waivers and they were given safety briefings by the tour guides. They wore hard hats and they walked in guided groups. The danger was part of the experience, but the catastrophe was something that wasn't supposed to happen. That afternoon, around 2:11 p.m, the volcano erupted. 22 people would die. 2 bodies would never be recovered. 25 others would suffer catastrophic burns, some over more than 90% of their bodies. Burns that would change their lives in unimaginable, life-altering ways. This wasn't a hidden volcano. This was a monitored hazard, and the risks were known, and they were measured daily. This video exposes what happens when scientific certainty, commercial tourism, and fragmented regulation collide. So why were tourists standing inside an active volcano during a period of sustained volcanic unrest? To answer that, we have to examine the system they trusted. That morning, Whakaari White Island looked as it usually did. Steam was rising from the crater floor. Sulphur drifted through the air. An unworldly landscape that had become routine. The volcano sat at volcanic alert level 2, moderate to heightened unrest. That meant elevated tremor, increased gas emissions, an active hydrothermal system. It didn't mean safe, and it didn't mean closed. The tourists to the island believed that if conditions were unsafe, somebody would have stopped the tours. Guides believed that if the alert level hadn't changed, then the risk hadn't changed. Operators believed they were complying with the law. Everyone relied on the same assumption. If it wasn't safe, someone would say so. And no one did. At 1:40 p.m, the first group stood near the crater lake. The second group was walking ahead. Boats were waiting offshore. And the assumption everybody held was simple. If it wasn't safe, someone would stop the tour. At 2:11 p.m, that assumption collapsed. Without visible warning, the crater erupted, and a sudden steam-driven explosion tore through the crater itself. And what erupted from the crater was superheated gas, ash, acidic particles, and temperatures high enough to destroy skin, muscle, and in some cases bone within seconds. Some died behind rocks, others tried desperately to reach the boats. Offshore passengers and crew watched in horror, knowing friends and family and strangers were still on the island. In those final seconds, there were no sirens, there was no countdown, and there was no time to run from it. There was simply no escape. The crater floor had become unsurvivable, and when the ash cleared, 22 people would not return home. The eruption might have been sudden, but the system had allowed people to be there in the first place. To understand what failed, we need to understand how safety systems were supposed to work at the island. New Zealand relied heavily on a deceptively simple formula: scientific monitoring plus operator judgment. GeoNet, the nation's hazard monitoring agency, tracked volcanic activity and issued volcanic alert levels from 0 to 5. On December 9, 2019, the day of the eruption, Whakaari White Island sat at volcanic alert level 2. It signalled elevated volcanic tremor, increased gas emissions and active hydrothermal conditions. But here's the critical distinction. The volcanic alert level system describes the behaviour of the volcano. It did not dictate whether tourists could stand on it, or even if they should be standing on it in the first place. There was no automatic closure at alert level 2. There was no legally binding stop-go threshold. The alert level was a scientific communication, and any decisions to go on the island was simply commercial. Responsibility sat with the operators under the Health and Safety at Work Act. The law required risks to be eliminated or minimised so far as is reasonably practicable. This legal test balances the likelihood of harm against the severity of consequences, the cost and feasibility of prevention. The eruption was not predicted in timing, but the eruption itself was foreseeable. So, if GMNet just measured the data, the tour operators just ran the boats. So who actually says no here? Because in law, the distinction matters. Responsibility over the island was fragmented. GeoNet monitored the volcano. WorkSafe enforced workplace safety law. The Ministry of Business and Innovation and Employment oversaw the Adventure Activity Framework. Each had a role. There was no real-time shutdown authority. There was no automatic link between the Alert Level 2 and public access, nor was there any central authority empowered to close the island based on sustained unrest. There was no mandatory threshold that converted uncertainty into restriction, so the system defaulted to the legal minimum of self-management. Operators read bulletins and remember, of course, that those same tour operators are not volcanologists. And each day the tour operators checked the alert levels, they assessed the weather, they looked at the crater, and over time, routines formed their approach. So their approach was shaped less by scientific uncertainty and more by routine. And this came down to three assumptions. If the volcano alert level hadn't changed, then the risk profile hadn't changed either. Elevated risk was accepted because the risk had not been elevated in the previous months. It was the same volcanic alert level. The visual calm of the volcano outweighed any scientific uncertainty. Each successive tour reinforced the last, until the day it didn't. After the eruption, WorkSafe brought charges under the Health and Safety at Work Act. The court ruled that the eruption was not predictable, but it was a known hazard. The question was not, could you predict the minute the volcano will erupt? It was, did you adequately assess the catastrophic consequences of such an eruption? Well, the court found that the risk assessment had not sufficiently accounted for the worst case scenario of a sudden eruption when visitors were on the island. The judgment itself focused on inadequate site-specific hazard analysis, over-reliance on routine based on previous volcanic unrest, failure to fully account for worst case scenarios. In other words, low likelihood did not excuse high consequence events such as the one that happened on the island that day. Many of the operators were convicted and penalties imposed on them, but the trial exposed something deeper. The regulatory framework had never clearly defined how scientific alert levels should translate into human access decisions on the island. The court determined liability only, and it did not redesign the system. Well, this was not the first time New Zealand had relied on an operator to self-manage a high-risk environment. In 2010, the Pike River mine disaster killed 29 men in an underground coal mine. Methane readings were known, the ventilation concerns were documented, and hazards were measured. And the law placed primary responsibility on the mine owners. The regulator only intervened after catastrophe, and at Whakaari White Island, volcanic arrest was known. The hazard was measured, and again, responsibility rested primarily with the commercial operators. In both cases, uncertainty lived within a commercial profit-driven system. We promised after Pike River that we wouldn't allow such a thing to happen again, where profit outweighed safety. Yet here, on an active volcano, the exact same silence occurred. The system just didn't fail on the day of the eruption. It failed the moment we decided self-regulation was enough for a ticking time bomb. And in both cases, accountability was clearest after lives were lost. After the Whakaari White Island disaster, adventure tourism auditing became stricter. Risk documentation required intensification. There was greater emphasis placed on low likelihood, high consequence hazards. But the core legislation, the Health and Safety at Work Act, did not fundamentally change. Primary responsibility still sits with commercial operators. The regulators oversee and they do not command, which raises a systemic question. Is self-management ever sufficient when the hazard is technically complex and scientifically uncertain and is capable of killing dozens in seconds? Adventure tourism operators now face stricter auditing, more formalised risk documentation, greater emphasis on low likelihood, high consequence events. To this day, Whakaari White Island remains closed to commercial tourism, and it will never likely be reopened. But the core legislation, the Health and Safety at Work Act, has not fundamentally changed, and the philosophy at the centre of the Act remains substantially the same. Primary responsibility still sits with commercial operators. They make the decisions, they sign off on the risks, they keep tourism moving. But the regulator stood above that system, and they were tasked not with profit, but with protection. They saw the warning signs, they monitored the compliance, and they led the authority to intervene. So why didn't they stop it? And here's the deeper systemic question. After everything that happened, was the structure truly transformed, or was it quietly reinforced, redesigned just enough to survive the scandal, but not enough to prevent the next tragedy? What do you think? Did the system learn, or did it protect itself? Whakaari White Island was not precisely predictable. It was always uncertain, and uncertainty was part of what was being sold. Visitors to the island were promised proximity to danger, but not exposure to catastrophe. When the disaster struck, legislative breaches were identified and penalties were imposed and reforms introduced. But the deeper issue remains unresolved. In high-risk industries like adventure tourism, who decides what level of uncertainty is acceptable? The operators, the regulators, or the state itself? Because when risks become profitable, uncertainty becomes its product. When volatility can be priced and packaged, it can be sold. Catastrophes stop being unthinkable, they become a model, a forecast of projected profit. But what the financial models never carry is the weight of a mother identifying her child, the silence at an empty dinner table. On paper, it's liability. In reality, it's funerals. Who is it that decides how much of its society it's willing to sell? And if you're interested in how government failure and regulatory breakdowns can lead to tragedy, check out my video below on the Pike River mine disaster, where I examine how warnings were ignored and why no one was ultimately held accountable for the deaths of 29 men. For now, I'll see you in the next video. Take care.